Hi everyone, Professor Carson here. This is going to be a quick lecture about communication theories. If you've done the reading, you should have a basic understanding of the field of communications. This lecture is going to go a little bit more into detail about communications, the subfields within communications, and then also some specific theories that we'll actually use and talk about later in this course. So our objectives for this video, number one, we're going to learn the basics about the field of communication. We're going to learn about what a theory is in communication, the research methods that are used in the field of communication, and the subfields of communication. We'll also talk about some theories of communication, and then we'll make sure that we know how to use communication theories as we study business communication. A communication theory is a proposed explanation of how communication works. Some of these theories will use models to illustrate what communication looks like. Others will identify patterns that keep happening over and over again. Some will be more process-driven, where you might see patterns, but it's always in step one, step two, step three, one after the other. And some will just look at the properties or the characteristics of communication and try to describe those. Together, these explanations can help us understand what is going on with communication, help us predict what might happen in the future based on what we know about the communication, and lastly, even affect communication phenomena, which is kind of a fancy way of saying it helps us do or change things in communication, which especially for business communication is very important because that's what's actually going to help us achieve our goals using communication. So to create and even test communication theories, there's a lot of different methods that we use, and this is just going to go over some of the big ones. Surveys are very common, where you collect a large sample of data from a large group of people and then analyze that data. Interviews and focus groups are a lot more focused, in that you can have more of a conversation with an interview, or a focus group might let you have more open-endedness with the participants and let them explore more of their thoughts and experiences than a survey would let them. Content analysis is when we will analyze a message, so something like an advertisement, a speech, a social media post, and then we'll look really closely about the choices made in creating that message and what trends or themes that we see in that. Sometimes we'll do experiments, kind of similar to psychology, where we have something we want to test, so we'll create a test to see the cause and effect relationships and see if we can actually measure the outcome the way we expect. And lastly, sometimes we'll do observation. Ethnography is kind of a specific method within observation, but observation is just when you watch people who are communicating, you take note of what you're observing, and then you try to make sense of that data after the observation. But these are just some of the ways that we create knowledge and create theories within communication. So there are a lot of subfields of communication that people choose to focus on, and I've tried to organize them in a way that makes it a little easier to see. Sometimes you might look at it in terms of the medium, so what medium is being used to carry that communication. We'll talk a lot about interpersonal communication, which is when one person is communicating with another person. Sometimes it's a conversation, sometimes it's even an email, but that's just one person to another. And then on the complete other side of it, you might have mass communication, which is when one person or one organization tries to send their messages to a massive audience, maybe their entire city, maybe an entire country, maybe an entire organization. You might even focus on some different areas instead of size, like computer-mediated communication, where you look specifically at how communication occurs online or on computers, rather than necessarily the size of people communicating with each other. Sometimes you might look at it by the component of communication, and each of these are different properties or characteristics of communication. If you're looking specifically at communication's ability to persuade people, then you might be looking at persuasive communication. If you're looking at the ethics of communication, then you might look at, is this communication ethical or not? And that would be a part of that subfield of ethical communication. Some communication is verbal, some communication is nonverbal. But if you specifically want to study verbal communication and how people use words to communicate, then verbal communication would be a subfield that would fall under. And then lastly, there's a lot of research and a lot of communication writings about where you're applying it to. Business communication is one of them. We take communication concepts and we apply it to business, but sometimes they'll apply it to, health, organizational. I've seen science communication really come up in recent years. And then sometimes it might be more to a specific activity. So public relations is an activity, public speaking is an activity, and you might apply communication more towards what the communication activity that is being done is. But this kind of goes to show that communication is a very wide field. There's a lot of stuff to discover in this field, and I've kind of highlighted the ones that we'll be talking about the most in this class. But if you're curious about any of these other ones, definitely take a look at them and see what they have to talk about. With that being said, I don't want you to feel like these subfields are completely separate from one another. A lot of them will share ideas and work together in order to create our knowledge of communication. For example, face negotiation theory may have been founded in intercultural communication, but we'll still use it and apply it to interpersonal communication, and even use interpersonal communication to test the theory and learn more about the theory. Another example, social penetration theory and social exchange theory were both founded by the field of psychology. It was psychologists who created those theories, but we still use those theories in communication, and we'll still test and try to create more understanding of these phenomena that the theories explore using our own methods in communication in order to, grow and learn more about that theory. So the first theory we'll talk about is one that you've seen in the reading before. It's the communication process. The idea that you have a source of information who's trying to get the information to a receiver. The source encodes the information, sends it across using a channel, and then the receiver takes the message and decodes it in order for them to understand it themselves. The receiver might give feedback to the source so that the source knows if they understand it. And throughout this whole process, there might be interference that disrupts part of this process and disrupts the message from getting from the source to the receiver. This model is very focused on information getting from one person to another, and you might find that, it's really hard to apply this model to the idea of two people creating a message together or creating meaning together or building a relationship with one another. So this doesn't necessarily apply to every communication scenario, but we can apply this to something like a meeting where you have someone leading a meeting who's trying to get information to a group of people who are listening to the person leading the meeting. And if there's some sort of disruption or some reason that people aren't understanding the information that's trying to be sent, you might use a model like this to analyze the different parts of the communication process and try to figure out which part of the process isn't working and which part of the process isn't letting that information flow smoothly from that source to the receiver. So the second theory we'll talk about is communication accommodation theory. This is a theory that was developed in the 1970s by social psychologist Howard Giles, and the basic idea is that people often adjust the way they communicate depending on who they're talking to. We don't all speak exactly the same way to every person. Instead, we naturally adapt our communication based on the situation. So the first concept is convergence, which means changing your communication to become more like the other person. This could mean matching their tone, vocabulary, speaking speed, or level of formality, and people often do this to fit in, build trust, or create a sense of connection. When it's done naturally, convergence can increase rapport and make people seem more likable. But also, when done unsuccessfully, it can be a little weird and off-putting. The second concept is divergence, which is the opposite. Instead of becoming more similar, a person intentionally emphasizes the differences in their communication. This is often done to reinforce group identity or create distance from another group. For example, a group may develop their own jargon or communication styles, or a person may intentionally become more formal to establish their professionalism. This theory has a lot of practical applications in business. Think about customer service. Employees often converge by matching a customer's communication style to make the interaction more comfortable. Salespeople may adapt their language depending on whether they're talking to a technical expert or somebody who has no industry knowledge. These methods can create likability and trust at a time when having that is important to achieve an objective. On the other hand, if two business departments don't like each other, they might use divergence to show how they're different or better than the other group. But divergence isn't always nefarious. So for example, let's say that you recently got promoted and you now manage people you used to be casual and used to be friends with. Even if you still like them, you may not joke around with them as much as you used to because you have to demonstrate that, at work at least, you are held to a higher expectation for being professional and need your employees to understand that key difference. So whether you adjust your own communication or see someone else adjusting their communication, understanding convergence and divergence can be a very helpful tool in business. Next, let's talk about face negotiation theory, which, if you remember, comes from the subfield of intercultural communication. This theory was developed by communication theorist Stella Ting Toomey in 1985. The theory starts with the idea that despite cultural differences, everyone has what's called face. Face is basically the image or reputation that we want other people to have of us. Most people want to be seen as competent, respectful, and worthy of respect, and that's especially true during conflict. Now, I want you to remember that this theory focuses most on conflict and, by extension, negotiation. Not only will you find that this theory applies pretty directly to intercultural conflict and negotiation in business, but there's actually a lot of research that applies this theory to intercultural and international business negotiation, if that's something you're interested in learning more about. But anyways, because people care about their face, they engage in what's called face work. Face work includes the communication strategies we use to protect our own image, repair our image if it's threatened, or even to support or challenge someone else's face. For example, apologizing after making a mistake is face work, but so is criticizing someone in front of a group, because that threatens their face. The interesting part of this theory is that different cultures approach face differently. Collectivistic cultures, who generally seek the collective good, tend to value maintaining the face of everyone involved. The goal is often to preserve harmony and avoid embarrassing either side. Individualistic cultures, on the other hand, place greater emphasis on protecting one's own face, even if that means creating conflict or disagreeing openly with another person. In business, this theory helps explain why conflict doesn't look the same everywhere. A manager working with an international team may find that some employees prefer direct disagreement, while others avoid confrontation and try to save everyone's face. Neither approach is necessarily right or wrong, they're just based on different cultural values, and understanding those differences helps leaders choose communication strategies that build relationships instead of unintentionally creating conflict. The last theory we'll talk about in this lecture is symbolic interactionism. This theory was developed in the early 1900s by philosopher and psychologist George Herbert Mead, and it's based on a pretty simple idea. People don't just react to things in the world as they are, they react to the meanings they have given those things. And those meanings come from our social interactions. As we interact with other people, we learn what different words, behaviors, objects, and actions symbolize. Then, through our own inner conversations or our inner thoughts, we interpret these symbols and decide how to respond. In other words, the reality we experience is shaped by the meanings we've learned through communication. This has a lot of applications in business because organizations are full of symbols. Think about a corner office, a job title like vice president, a company logo, a business suit, or even getting invited to an important meeting. None of these things have inherent meaning. Instead, we've collectively decided what they represent. A corner office might symbolize success or authority. Being left out of a meeting might symbolize that your opinion isn't valued. Whether those interpretations are actually true or not, people often act as though they are. So think about this. What are some other symbols that exist in business? How are those symbols interpreted? What kind of workplace reality do they create? Understanding those shared meanings can help explain why people behave the way they do in organizations, even when no one explicitly tells them how to act. So as we think a little more broadly about how we apply communication theories to business, remember what we talked about in terms of what communication theories are for. We might use them to better understand yourself and others, including people's goals, wants, identity, relationship, messages, communication. We might use them to consider how people will respond to communication by you or by others, and whether those responses align with your goals or other people's goals. And we might use communication methods to create the effects, the changes, and the relationships that you want to make in order to achieve your business goals. So think about that as you think, how does communication theory help you if you try to do business?